The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain of eastern Afghanistan as Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his medical pack for the third time that morning. The weight felt familiar against his shoulders, like an old friend he had grown accustomed to carrying through hell and back. As a Navy SEAL medic with 12 years of service under his belt, Marcus had seen more bloodshed than most people could imagine in their worst nightmares. Yet today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The team of 8 SEALs moved silently through the barren landscape, their boots making barely a whisper against the sun-baked earth. They were tracking a high-value target who had been responsible for several attacks on coalition forces in the region. Intelligence suggested the target was holed up in a compound about 2 clicks ahead, and their mission was simple: capture or eliminate. Marcus glanced at his teammates, men he had served alongside for years. There was Jake Sullivan, their team leader, whose calm demeanor under fire had saved their lives more times than Marcus could count. Behind him moved Tommy Chun, their communications specialist, whose quick wit and technical expertise had gotten them out of countless tight spots. The rest of the team consisted of seasoned operators, each one a brother Marcus would gladly die for. As they approached a ridge overlooking their target area, Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always preceded combat operations. It wasn't fear that had been beaten out of him years ago during his training. Instead, it was a heightened awareness, an internal alarm system that had kept him alive through dozens of missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. The compound below them looked quiet, almost too quiet. A collection of mud brick buildings surrounded by a low wall. It appeared to be a typical Afghan family dwelling. But Marcus had learned long ago that appearances in this part of the world could be deadly deceptive. His trained eyes scanned the structure, looking for anything out of place: unusual antenna placements, reinforced positions, or signs of recent activity. Jake signaled for the team to take positions. Marcus found himself behind a cluster of rocks that provided good cover while still allowing him a clear view of the compound. He checked his medical supplies one more time, running through his mental checklist of trauma procedures. In his experience, something always went wrong during these operations, and when it did, lives often hung in the balance of his medical skills and the supplies in his pack. The plan was straightforward. Alpha Team would breach the main entrance while Bravo Team secured the rear exit. Marcus would stay with Jake and provide medical support as needed. They had rehearsed similar operations hundreds of times, and each man knew his role perfectly. As they waited for Jake's signal to move, Marcus reflected on the path that had brought him to this desolate ridge in Afghanistan. He had grown up in a small town in Texas, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher. His parents had instilled in him a strong sense of duty and service to others, values that had guided him through his decision to join the Navy and eventually earn his place among the SEALs. The medical training had come later, after he had already proven himself as an operator. The Navy had sent him to some of the most advanced trauma medicine courses available, and he had supplemented this training with countless hours of study and practical experience in the field. He took pride in his ability to save lives under the worst possible conditions, often while under enemy fire. But lately, Marcus had been questioning whether the endless cycle of violence and death was worth the cost. He had seen too many good men die, too many families destroyed by the machinery of war. The faces of the wounded and dying haunted his dreams, and he found himself wondering if he was making any real difference in this forgotten corner of the world. A sharp hand signal from Jake snapped Marcus back to the present. It was time to move. The team rose as one and began their descent toward the compound, moving with the fluid precision that came from years of training and combat experience. As they drew closer to their target, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Children's toys were scattered around the courtyard. A small bicycle, some colorful balls, and what looked like handmade dolls. This wasn't just a safe house. It was a family home. The intelligence had been wrong before, but the implications of this mistake could be catastrophic. He caught Jake's eye and pointed toward the toys, hoping his team leader would call off the assault. But Jake had already seen them, and made the calculation that Marcus dreaded. The mission would continue. Their target was too important to let escape based on the possibility that civilians might be present. Marcus felt his heart rate spike as they reached the compound wall. His medical training had taught him to save lives, but his military training demanded that he follow orders, even when those orders might result in innocent casualties. The moral conflict tore at him as he prepared to enter the compound behind his teammates. The breach went smoothly at first. Alpha Team blew the front door with a small explosive charge while Bravo Team secured the rear exit. Marcus followed Jake through the smoking entrance, his weapon at the ready and his medical pack bouncing against his back. The interior of the compound was dark and confusing, with narrow hallways and multiple rooms branching off in different directions. Marcus could hear his teammates moving through the structure, their voices calling out clear signals as they cleared each room. So far, no contact with the enemy, but also no sign of their target. It was in the third room they cleared that Marcus's world changed forever. As Jake kicked open a wooden door, Marcus saw what lay beyond and felt his soul crack like ice under pressure. 3 young children, none older than 10, huddled together in the corner of what appeared to be a bedroom. Their eyes were wide with terror, and the smallest one, a girl who couldn't have been more than 5, was crying silently. But it wasn't just the presence of the children that shattered something inside Marcus. It was what he saw in their eyes, not just fear but recognition. These children had seen American soldiers before, had experienced raids like this one. The trauma was written across their faces like a roadmap of pain and confusion. Jake hesitated for just a moment, his weapon lowering slightly as he processed the scene. In that instant of uncertainty, Marcus heard a sound that would echo in his nightmares for years to come. The distinctive click of a rifle safety being disengaged somewhere behind them. "Contact rear," came Tommy's voice over the radio, followed immediately by the sharp crack of gunfire. The compound erupted into chaos as the firefight began in earnest. Marcus could hear rounds impacting the walls around them, sending chips of mud brick flying through the air. But even as his training kicked in and he moved to find cover, Marcus couldn't tear his eyes away from the children. The little girl had stopped crying and was now staring directly at him with an expression that cut through all his military conditioning and spoke directly to his humanity. In that moment, crouched in a war-torn room with bullets flying around him, Marcus Rodriguez understood something that would change him forever. These children weren't just collateral damage in some larger geopolitical game. They were human beings whose lives were being destroyed by forces beyond their control, and he was part of the machine that was destroying them. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his hands shake. For 12 years, he had told himself that he was serving a greater good, that the violence and death were necessary to protect innocent people. But looking into the eyes of that terrified little girl, he saw the truth that he had been avoiding. Sometimes the people who needed protection were the ones caught in the crossfire of his protection. Jake was shouting something at him, but Marcus couldn't process the words. The sound of gunfire seemed to fade into the background as a profound silence settled over his mind. It wasn't the absence of sound, but rather the presence of something much deeper, a moment of perfect clarity in which all the noise and confusion of war fell away, leaving only truth. He thought of his own childhood, of the safety and security his parents had provided. He thought of his sister's children back in Texas, how they laughed and played without fear, how they trusted the adults in their lives to keep them safe. And then he looked again at the 3 children cowering in the corner of this room, and he understood that somewhere along the way, he had become part of the very thing that children should be protected from. The firefight continued around them, but Marcus felt disconnected from it, as if he were watching events unfold from a great distance. His hands moved automatically, checking his weapon and scanning for threats, but his mind was elsewhere, processing the implications of what he had just realized. Jake grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door, shouting instructions that Marcus followed without thinking. They moved through the compound, clearing rooms and searching for their target. But Marcus felt like he was sleepwalking through a nightmare. Every corner they turned, every door they kicked open, he expected to find more children, more innocent faces staring at him with confusion and terror. The target wasn't in the compound. After 30 minutes of searching and fighting, the team realized they had been given bad intelligence. The high-value target they were hunting had either never been there or had escaped before their arrival. All they had accomplished was to terrorize a family and turn their home into a battlefield. As they prepared to extract from the area, Marcus found himself back in the room with the 3 children. They were still huddled in the corner, but now they were completely silent, their eyes following his every movement. The little girl who had been crying earlier now stared at him with an expression that seemed far too old for a young face. Marcus reached into his pack and pulled out a granola bar, one of his emergency rations. He held it out to the children, hoping to offer some small gesture of kindness in the midst of the horror they had experienced. But the children didn't move. They simply stared at him with a mixture of fear and incomprehension that made his chest ache. He placed the granola bar on the floor between them and slowly backed away, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. But as he left the room, he heard the little girl speak for the first time. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words in broken English pierced through his soul like a knife. "Why do you hurt us?" Marcus stopped in his tracks, the question hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He turned back to look at her, but she had already turned away, burying her face in her brother's shoulder. The simple question contained within it all the complexity and moral ambiguity of everything he had been doing for the past 12 years. The extraction went smoothly, with no casualties on either side beyond some minor injuries from flying debris. As the team moved away from the compound and toward their extraction point, Marcus walked in mechanical silence, his mind still processing what had happened back in that room. His teammates were already conducting their after-action review, analyzing what had gone wrong with the intelligence and how they could improve their procedures for future operations. But Marcus found himself unable to participate in the discussion. Every word they spoke seemed to come from a great distance, as if he were hearing them through water. Jake noticed his silence and fell back to walk beside him. "You okay, Doc?" he asked, using the nickname the team had given him because of his medical skills. "You seem a little off." Marcus wanted to explain what he was feeling, wanted to share the profound shift that had occurred in his understanding of what they were doing. But he found that he had no words for it. How could he explain to Jake, who had devoted his entire adult life to military service, that he was beginning to question the very foundation of everything they believed in? "I'm fine," he said instead, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. "Just tired." But Marcus knew he wasn't fine. Something fundamental had changed inside him during those few minutes in the compound, something that could never be unchanged. The silence that had settled over his mind during the firefight wasn't going away. If anything, it was growing deeper, spreading through his consciousness like ink through water. As they reached their extraction point and waited for the helicopter that would take them back to base, Marcus found himself staring back toward the compound they had just left. Somewhere in that cluster of mud brick buildings, 3 children were probably still huddled together, trying to make sense of what had happened to them. Their home had been violated, their sense of safety shattered. And for what? The question the little girl had asked, "Why do you hurt us?" continued to echo in his mind as the helicopter touched down and the team prepared to board. It was a question that demanded an answer, but Marcus was beginning to realize that he didn't have one. Or rather, the answers he had been given during his years of service were starting to feel inadequate and hollow. As the helicopter lifted off and carried them away from the scene, Marcus closed his eyes and tried to push away the image of those 3 frightened children. But he knew that image would stay with him forever, a constant reminder of the moment when his certainty about right and wrong had crumbled like dust in his hands. The silence that had descended upon him during the firefight was no longer just in his mind. It had settled into his soul, and Marcus suspected that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The warrior he had been was gone, replaced by someone he didn't yet recognize, someone who was beginning to see the world through very different eyes. In the days that would follow, Marcus would struggle to understand what had happened to him in that compound. He would search for words to describe the transformation he had undergone, but language seemed inadequate to capture the profound shift in his worldview. All he knew for certain was that the question posed by a terrified 5-year-old girl had shattered his assumptions about duty, honor, and service in ways that would take him years to fully comprehend. The weeks following the compound raid passed in a strange blur for Marcus Rodriguez. On the surface, everything appeared normal. He continued his duties as the team medic, participated in training exercises, and maintained his equipment with the same meticulous attention to detail that had always defined his service. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted, and the silence that had descended upon him during that firefight continued to grow deeper. Back at the forward operating base, Marcus found himself unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face of that little girl, heard her voice asking why they hurt her. The question had burrowed into his consciousness like a parasite, feeding on his doubts and growing stronger with each passing day. He would lie awake on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling of the tent he shared with 3 other SEALs, and try to make sense of what had happened to him. His teammates began to notice his changed demeanor, though they interpreted it in different ways. Some assumed he was simply dealing with a normal stress that came with their line of work. Others wondered if he might be suffering from combat fatigue, a condition that even the most elite soldiers weren't immune to after extended deployments. Jake Sullivan, their team leader, was particularly concerned. He had served with Marcus for over 4 years and had never seen him so withdrawn and introspective. During their downtime, Jake would try to engage Marcus in conversation, but the medic seemed to be somewhere else entirely, his responses mechanical and distant. "Doc, you sure everything's okay?" Jake asked one evening as they sat outside their tent cleaning their weapons. "You've been quiet lately." "More than usual." Marcus looked up from the rifle he was methodically disassembling, his hands moving through the familiar motions without conscious thought. "Just thinking about things," he said, which was both completely true and entirely inadequate as an explanation. "Want to talk about it?" Jake pressed. "Sometimes it helps to get stuff out of your head." But Marcus shook his head. How could he explain to Jake that he was questioning everything they stood for? How could he tell a man who had dedicated his life to military service that he was beginning to see their missions not as noble acts of protection, but as exercises in violence that hurt the very people they claimed to be helping? The truth was, Marcus was afraid of what Jake would think if he knew the thoughts that were consuming him. The SEAL community was built on loyalty, brotherhood, and an unquestioning commitment to the mission. Doubts were seen as weakness, and weakness could get people killed. Marcus knew that if he voiced his concerns, he would be seen as a liability, someone who could no longer be trusted in critical situations. So he kept his silence, but that silence was becoming a weight that pressed down on him with increasing force. He began to withdraw from the informal gatherings that had always been an important part of team bonding. When the others played cards or watched movies during their off hours, Marcus would find excuses to be elsewhere, usually walking the perimeter of the base or finding some isolated spot where he could be alone with his thoughts. It was during one of these solitary walks that Marcus encountered Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, a military intelligence analyst who had been attached to their unit for the past month. Elena was sharp, dedicated, and had a reputation for providing accurate and timely intelligence that had saved numerous lives during operations throughout the region. "Trouble sleeping?" she asked as Marcus walked past the intelligence tent where she was working late into the night. Marcus paused, surprised to find someone else awake at this hour. "Something like that," he said. Elena studied him for a moment, her dark eyes taking in his disheveled appearance and the fatigue etched into his features. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. "I could use a break from staring at these reports." They walked together in comfortable silence for several minutes. their feet crunching softly on the gravel paths that crisscrossed the base. The night air was cool and clear, with stars visible overhead in a way that was impossible in most parts of the civilized world. Under different circumstances, Marcus might have found the scene peaceful, even beautiful. You know, Elena said eventually, I've been doing intelligence work for 8 years, and I've learned to read people pretty well. You look like someone who's carrying around a heavy burden. Marcus glanced at her, wondering how much he dared to reveal. Elena was military, but she wasn't part of his immediate team. Maybe that made her safer to talk to, or maybe it made her more dangerous. He wasn't sure. We all carry burdens in this job, he said carefully. True, Elena agreed. But some burdens are heavier than others, and some people try to carry them alone when they don't have to. There was something in her tone that suggested she understood more than she was letting on. Marcus found himself studying her face in the dim light that filtered from the various tints and structures around them. There was intelligence there, but also compassion and perhaps a hint of her own struggles with the moral complexities of their work. Have you ever wondered if we're really making a difference here? Marcus asked suddenly, the question escaping before he could stop himself. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus immediately regretted his words. But then she spoke, her voice soft and thoughtful. Every day, she said. Every single day. The admission hit Marcus like a revelation. He had assumed that he was alone in his doubts, that his teammates and colleagues were all fully committed to their mission without question. But here was someone else who struggled with the same fundamental questions that were tearing him apart. The thing about intelligence work, Elena continued, is that you see the bigger picture sometimes. You see the patterns, the unintended consequences, the way our actions ripple out in ways we never anticipated. It can be difficult. Marcus felt a surge of relief, so powerful it almost brought tears to his eyes. For the first time since the incident at the compound, he didn't feel completely alone with his doubts and questions. There was a mission a few weeks ago, he said slowly, testing the waters. We hit a compound based on intelligence that turned out to be wrong. There were children there. Elena nodded. I heard about that. I also heard that no civilians were harmed. Not physically, Marcus said, but those kids, they were terrified, and one of them asked me why we hurt them. I've been thinking about that question ever since. They had stopped walking and were now standing near the edge of the base, looking out at the dark landscape beyond the perimeter fence. The silence stretched between them, but it felt different from the oppressive silence that had been haunting Marcus. This was a shared silence, a moment of mutual understanding. You know what the hardest part of my job is? Elena asked. It's not analyzing enemy movements or predicting attack patterns. It's writing the reports that justify our actions to the people back home. It's finding ways to explain why what we're doing here makes sense when sometimes I'm not sure it does. Marcus turned to look at her, seeing his own struggles reflected in her expression. How do you deal with it? Some days better than others, she admitted. But I've learned that the questions you're asking aren't a sign of weakness or disloyalty. They're a sign that you still have your humanity intact. The moment we stop questioning what we're doing, the moment we become completely comfortable with violence, that's when we lose something essential about who we are. Her words resonated with something deep inside Marcus, offering a perspective he hadn't considered before. Maybe his doubts weren't a betrayal of his duty, but rather proof that he hadn't completely surrendered his moral compass to the machinery of war. The problem is, Marcus said, I don't know what to do with these feelings. I can't just stop being a SEAL, but I'm not sure I can keep doing what I've been doing either. Elena was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing her words carefully. Have you ever considered that maybe your role could evolve? That there might be ways to serve that align better with what you're feeling now? Marcus frowned, not understanding what she meant. Your medical training, Elena explained. The way you've saved lives, helped people. That's always been the part of your job that felt right, hasn't it? Marcus thought about it and realized she was correct. Throughout all his years of service, the moments that had felt most meaningful were the ones where he was healing rather than harming, where he was saving lives rather than ending them. Even in the middle of firefights, when he was treating wounded teammates or occasionally wounded enemies, he felt like he was fulfilling his true purpose. There are organizations that do medical work in conflict zones, Elena continued. Doctors Without Borders, the International Red Cross, smaller NGOs that work in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. They need people with your skills and experience, people who can provide medical care under fire. The idea had never occurred to Marcus before, but as Elena spoke about it, he felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. The possibility that he could use his skills to help people without being part of a military operation that might harm others opened up new possibilities he hadn't imagined. But that would mean leaving the SEALs, Marcus said. Leaving my team. It would, Elena agreed. And I'm not saying it would be easy, but sometimes we have to choose between loyalty to our brothers and loyalty to our principles. Both are important, but when they come into conflict, she left the sentence hanging, but Marcus understood what she meant. The choice between his commitment to his teammates and his growing conviction that what they were doing was wrong wasn't a choice he wanted to make, but it might be one he had to face. Over the following days, Marcus found himself thinking constantly about his conversation with Elena. The idea of leaving the SEALs to work for a humanitarian organization felt both terrifying and liberating. It would mean giving up everything he had worked for over the past 12 years, walking away from the brotherhood that had defined his adult life. But it might also mean finding a way to live with himself again. He began to research humanitarian organizations online during his off-duty time, reading about their work and the requirements for joining their medical teams. What he found both excited and intimidated him. These organizations worked in some of the most dangerous and challenging environments on Earth, providing medical care to people caught in conflicts, natural disasters, and humanitarian crises. The work was dangerous, often more dangerous than what he was doing as a SEAL, but it was danger with a different purpose. Instead of entering hostile territory to capture or kill targets, he would be entering it to save lives and provide relief to suffering people. The distinction felt crucial to him, but even as he researched these possibilities, Marcus struggled with the thought of leaving his teammates. These men had trusted him with their lives, had counted on him in the most desperate situations imaginable. Jake Sullivan had pulled him out of enemy fire. Tommy Chan had carried him to safety when he was wounded during a mission in Iraq 2 years earlier. How could he abandon these bonds for abstract principles? The internal conflict was tearing him apart, and it showed in his performance. During training exercises, he found himself hesitating in situations where he had previously acted without thinking. His reaction times were slower, his decision-making less decisive. It was subtle, but in the world of special operations, subtlety could be fatal. Jake finally confronted him about it after a particularly poor performance during a hostage rescue simulation. Marcus had missed several opportunities to provide critical medical intervention during the exercise, and his hesitation had resulted in theoretical casualties that would have been preventable. "Doc, we need to talk," Jake said after dismissing the rest of the team. And this time, I'm fine for an answer. They sat in Jake's small office, a cramped space filled with operational plans, equipment catalogs, and photos of the team during various deployments. Marcus had been in this office hundreds of times over the years, but now it felt foreign, as if he no longer belonged there. "I'm worried about you," Jake said without preamble. "Your performance is slipping, you're distant from the team, and today during the exercise, you hesitated in situations where hesitation kills people. What's going on?" Marcus looked at his team leader, this man who had become like a brother to him over their years of service together, and felt the weight of his deception. Jake deserved honesty, deserved to know that the man he counted on in life-or-death situations was questioning everything they stood for. "I'm having doubts," Marcus said finally, the words feeling like they were being torn from his throat. "About what we're doing here. About whether we're really helping anyone." Jake's expression didn't change, but Marcus could see the shock in his eyes. In their community, such doubts were rarely voiced, and when they were usually met with either immediate counseling or immediate removal from operational status. "Is this about the compound raid?" Jake asked. "The one with the children?" Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Jake leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "That was a tough one," he admitted. "Bad intelligence, civilians in the target area. It's the kind of situation that makes everyone question things." "Those kids were terrified," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And one of them asked me why we hurt them. I haven't been able to get that question out of my head." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus wondered if he was about to be relieved of duty, sent home for psychological evaluation, or worse, labeled as unreliable and unfit for service. "You know," Jake said eventually, "I think the fact that you're asking these questions makes you a better SEAL, not a worse one." Marcus looked up, surprised by the response. "The moment we stop caring about the impact of our actions, the moment we become comfortable with collateral damage, that's when we become something other than what we're supposed to be," Jake continued. "Your doubt isn't a weakness. Document. It's your conscience working the way it should." The words were similar to what Elena had told him, but coming from Jake, they carried additional weight. This was his team leader, a man whose judgment he trusted completely, telling him that his struggles weren't a betrayal but a sign of his humanity. "But I can't do my job effectively if I'm questioning every decision," Marcus said. "Today proved that." "Maybe," Jake agreed. "Or maybe you just need to find a different way to serve." Marcus stared at him, wondering if Jake somehow knew about his conversations with Elena and his research into humanitarian organizations. "I've been doing this for 15 years, Jake said. "I've seen good people burn out, seen them reach a point where they can't reconcile what we do with who they are. There's no shame in that, document. And there's no shame in finding a different path." The conversation continued for another hour, with Jake sharing his own moments of doubt and the ways he had learned to cope with the moral complexities of their work. By the end, Marcus felt both relieved and terrified. He was relieved to know that his struggles were understood and accepted by the man whose opinion mattered most to him professionally. But he was also terrified because Jake's understanding seemed to point toward only one conclusion, that his time as a SEAL was coming to an end. That night, Marcus called Elena and asked if they could meet again. When she arrived at their usual spot near the perimeter fence, he could see in her expression that she had been expecting this conversation. "I think I'm ready to start looking at other options," he said without preamble. Elena nodded, pulling a folder from the bag she was carrying. "I thought you might be. I took the liberty of gathering some information for you." The folder contained detailed information about several humanitarian organizations, including job descriptions, application procedures, and first-hand account from medical professionals who had made the transition from military to humanitarian work. As Marcus flipped through the pages, he felt the same mixture of excitement and terror that had been plaguing him for weeks. "There's one organization in particular I think you should consider," Elena said, pointing to a section marked with a small paper clip. "They specialize in providing emergency medical care in active conflict zones. They're looking for medics with combat experience who can work effectively under fire." Marcus read through the information, his heart racing as he realized that everything described matched his skills and experience perfectly. This organization worked in Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, and other war-torn regions, providing medical care to civilians caught in the crossfire of conflicts they hadn't chosen to be part of. "The application process is rigorous," Elena warned. "They need to be sure that applicants can handle the psychological stress of working in war zones while maintaining their commitment to neutrality and humanitarian principles." "How do I know if I could do that?" Marcus asked. Elena smiled sadly. "The fact that you're asking that question tells me you probably can. The people who can't usually don't think to ask." As Marcus continued reading through the materials, he began to envision a different future for himself. Instead of breaching compounds to capture or kill enemy combatants, he would be establishing field hospitals to save lives. Instead of carrying weapons designed to end lives, he would be carrying medical supplies designed to preserve them. The transition wouldn't be easy. He would need to leave behind not just his career, but his identity as a Navy SEAL. He would need to learn new protocols, adjust to different rules of engagement, and find ways to cope with seeing suffering without being able to eliminate its source through force. But for the first time since that day in the compound, Marcus felt like he had found a path forward that honored both his commitment to service and his growing conviction that healing was more important than harming. The silence that had settled over him wasn't going away. He understood that now. But maybe that silence wasn't meant to be overcome. Maybe it was meant to be listened to be understood as the voice of his conscience guiding him toward a different kind of courage. The decision to leave the SEALs wasn't made in a single moment of clarity, but rather through a series of small choices that gradually led Marcus Rodriguez away from the life he had known for 12 years. Each step felt both inevitable and terrifying, like walking across a bridge that disappeared behind him as he moved forward, making retreat impossible. The application process for Medical Relief International took 3 months to complete. During this time, Marcus continued his duties as a team medic, but everyone could sense that he was already somewhere else mentally. His teammates handled this transition with a kind of grace that spoke to the depth of their bond. They didn't make him feel guilty for his choice, even though his departure would leave a significant gap in their capabilities. The psychological evaluation required by Medical Relief International was unlike anything Marcus had experienced during his military career. Instead of testing his ability to compartmentalize emotions and function under stress, the evaluators wanted to understand his motivations, his ability to maintain neutrality in conflict zones, and his capacity to witness suffering without taking military action to stop it. Dr. Sarah Chun, the lead psychologist conducting his evaluation, was a woman in her 50s who had spent decades working with medical professionals transitioning from military to humanitarian roles. She had an uncanny ability to ask questions that cut straight to the heart of his internal struggles. Tell me about a time when you had to choose between following orders and following your conscience, she said during one session. Marcus thought immediately of the compound raid, but he found himself also remembering dozens of smaller moments throughout his career when he had felt the tension between his duties as a soldier and his instincts as a healer. There was the time he had been ordered to prioritize treating wounded SEALs over wounded enemy combatants, even though the enemy casualties were more severely injured. There was the mission where they had been forbidden from providing medical aid to civilians in a village they were passing through, despite obvious signs of a medical emergency. The hardest part, Marcus told Dr. Chun, has always been the moments when my medical training tells me to help someone, but my military training tells me they're not my responsibility. And how do you think you'll handle situations where you can provide medical aid, but can't address the root causes of the suffering you're treating? She asked. It was a crucial question, one that got to the heart of the transition he was attempting to make. As a SEAL, when he encountered a threat to innocent people, he could eliminate that threat with violence. As a humanitarian aid worker, he would have to watch people suffer for violence he was powerless to stop. I think, Marcus said slowly, that I've learned the difference between helping someone and solving their problems. Maybe I can't stop wars, but I can heal the wounds they create. Maybe I can't eliminate suffering, but I can reduce it. Dr. Chin made notes in her file, her expression unreadable. What about the friends you'll be leaving behind? How do you feel about abandoning your team? The question hit harder than Marcus had expected. I don't think I'm abandoning them, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I think I'm just finding a different way to serve. But they might see it as abandonment. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Some of them might. But the ones who really know me, they understand why I need to do this. The evaluation process also included extensive medical testing and skills assessment. Marcus had to demonstrate his ability to perform complex medical procedures under simulated combat conditions, manage mass casualty situations with limited resources, and work effectively with international teams whose members might not share a common language. During the skills assessment, Marcus worked alongside Dr. James Morrison, a veteran humanitarian aid worker who had spent 15 years providing medical care in conflict zones around the world. Dr. Morrison was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who had an air of unshakable calm that Marcus found both inspiring and intimidating. The most important skill you'll need, Dr. Morrison told him during a break between simulated emergency scenarios, isn't medical knowledge or technical expertise. It's the ability to maintain hope in the face of seemingly hopeless situations. Marcus thought about this as he worked through a simulation involving multiple wounded civilians in a bombed hospital. The scenario was designed to test not just his medical skills, but his ability to make difficult triage decisions while maintaining the humanitarian principle that all lives have equal value. In the simulation, Marcus had to choose which patients to treat first when resources were limited. Unlike his military experience, where wounded Americans took priority over wounded enemies, here every patient was simply a human being in need of help. The decision-making process felt both liberating and overwhelming. How do you live with the people you can't save? Marcus asked Dr. Morrison after completing the simulation. You honor them by saving the ones you can, Dr. Morrison replied simply. And you remember that every life you do save makes the world a little bit better. While Marcus was going through the application process, life at the forward operating base continued its familiar rhythm. But his teammates were already beginning to adjust to the idea that he would soon be gone. Jake Sullivan started cross-training other team members in advanced medical procedures, ensuring that Marcus's departure wouldn't leave them completely vulnerable. Tommy Chun, the communications specialist who had become one of Marcus's closest friends over the years, struggled more than the others with Marcus's decision. During a particularly honest conversation, he expressed his feelings about what he saw as Marcus's abandonment of the team. I get that you're having moral issues with what we do, Tommy said. But we save lives too, document. We stopped bad guys who would have killed innocent people. Doesn't that count for something? Marcus understood Tommy's perspective, and part of him agreed with it. They had participated in missions that genuinely protected innocent people from harm. But those missions were becoming increasingly rare, overshadowed by operations like the compound raid that seemed to create more suffering than they prevented. It counts for a lot, Marcus told his friend. But I can't keep doing something that goes against my conscience, even if it sometimes produces good results. So what about us? Tommy asked. What about your responsibility to the guys who count on you? It was the question Marcus had been dreading, the one that cut to the heart of his guilt about leaving. I think the best thing I can do for you guys is to be honest about who I am and what I can contribute. Right now, I'm not the medic you need. I'm too uncertain, too conflicted. You need someone who can act without hesitation. Tommy was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I don't like it, but I get it. Just promise me you won't forget about us completely. Never, Marcus said, and he meant it. These men would always be his brothers, even if he could no longer serve alongside them. The hardest conversation was with Jake Sullivan. As team leader, Jake had invested years in developing Marcus as both a medic and an operator. Marcus's departure represented not just the loss of a valued team member, but also the loss of a significant training investment. I want you to know, Jake told him during their final one-on-one meeting, that I think you're making the right choice. It's not the choice I would make, but it's the right choice for you. Marcus felt a wave of gratitude toward his team leader. Jake could have made his transition much more difficult by expressing disappointment or questioning his commitment. Instead, he was offering support and understanding. I'm scared, Marcus admitted. Scared that I'm making a mistake. Scared that I won't be good at humanitarian work. Scared that I'll regret leaving you guys. Fear is good, Jake said. It means you're taking this seriously. But, Doc, you've been struggling with this for months now. You can't keep doing a job that tears you apart inside. None of us want to serve with someone who's only there out of obligation. Jake's words were both reassuring and heartbreaking. Marcus realized that his team leader was essentially giving him permission to leave, acknowledging that his internal conflict had made him less effective as both a medic and a team member. There's something else, Jake said. I've talked to command about this, and they're willing to keep your recall status active for 2 years. If you decide humanitarian work isn't for you, you can come back without having to go through the entire qualification process again. The offer surprised Marcus. He had assumed that leaving the SEALs would be a permanent decision, that the military would view his departure as a betrayal that couldn't be forgiven. But Jake's words suggested that his commanders understood his struggles and were willing to leave the door open for his return. Why would they do that? Marcus asked. Because good people are hard to find, Jake replied. And because sometimes people need to try different paths before they figure out where they belong. As his departure date approached, Marcus found himself experiencing a strange mixture of excitement and melancholy. He was eager to begin his new role with Medical Relief International, but he was also mourning the end of a chapter of his life that had defined him for so long. His last mission as a Navy SEAL was a routine patrol through a village where they were building relationships with local leaders. It was the kind of mission Marcus had always preferred, low-key, focused on helping rather than harming, with minimal risk of civilian casualties. During the patrol, they stopped at a small clinic where local medical staff were treating patients with limited supplies and equipment. Marcus spent an hour working alongside the local doctor, a woman named Dr. Amara, who spoke excellent English and had trained at a medical school in Kabul before the security situation forced her to return to her village. "You are leaving the military?" Dr. Amara asked when Marcus mentioned his upcoming transition. "Yes," Marcus replied. "I'm going to work for a humanitarian organization." Dr. Amara smiled. "That is good. We need more people who understand both medicine and the realities of conflict. Sometimes the soldiers who want to help don't understand how to help effectively." Her words resonated with Marcus in a way he hadn't expected. Here was someone who had seen both American military operations and humanitarian aid efforts, and she was suggesting that his unique background might actually make him more effective as an aid worker rather than less. "What advice would you give me?" Marcus asked. Dr. Amara considered the question carefully. "Remember that the people you will be helping are not victims to be pitied, but human beings with dignity and strength. They have survived things that would break most people. Your job is not to save them, but to help them save themselves." As Marcus flew out of Afghanistan for the last time as a Navy SEAL, he thought about Dr. Amara's words. The idea that his role would be to support people's own strength rather than to rescue them from their circumstances felt like an important shift in perspective. The training program for Medical Relief International was held at a facility in Geneva, Switzerland, where Marcus spent 6 weeks learning the protocols and procedures that would govern his work as a humanitarian aid worker. The training was intensive and comprehensive, covering everything from advanced trauma medicine to cultural sensitivity to the legal frameworks that protected humanitarian workers in conflict zones. Marcus's classmates were an eclectic group of medical professionals from around the world. There were doctors leaving comfortable practices in developed countries to work in crisis zones, nurses who had grown tired of hospital bureaucracy and wanted to make a more direct impact, and paramedics seeking opportunities to use their skills in situations where they could make life or death differences. What struck Marcus most about his fellow trainees was their sense of purpose. Unlike the military, where motivation came from duty and brotherhood, these people were driven by a deeply personal commitment to reducing human suffering. Their passion was infectious, and Marcus found his own sense of purpose being rekindled in ways he hadn't experienced since his early days as a SEAL. The training also forced Marcus to confront some uncomfortable truths about his own motivations. During one session on maintaining neutrality in conflict zones, the instructor posed a hypothetical scenario that hit uncomfortably close to home. You're treating wounded civilians in a field hospital when you recognize one of the wounded as an insurgent who was responsible for an attack that killed American soldiers, the instructor said. How do you handle the situation? Marcus's first instinct was to refuse treatment or to provide minimal care while prioritizing others. But he caught himself and realized that this instinct came from his military training, not his medical ethics. You treat the patient according to medical need, not according to your personal feelings about their actions, he said, though the words felt strange coming from his mouth. And if you can't separate your personal feelings from your professional obligations, the instructor pressed, then you shouldn't be doing this work, Marcus replied, and as he said it, he understood that he was making a commitment to fundamentally change how he viewed the world. By the end of the training program, Marcus felt like he had been mentally and emotionally recalibrated. The silence that had settled over him after the compound raid was still there, but it had evolved into something different. Instead of being the absence of certainty, it had become a space for compassion and understanding. His first assignment was to a medical team working in northern Syria, where ongoing conflict had created a massive humanitarian crisis. Marcus would be responsible for managing a field hospital that treated both civilian casualties and refugees fleeing the fighting. As he prepared to deploy to Syria, Marcus realized that he was about to enter conflicts similar to the ones he had left behind in Afghanistan, but from a completely different perspective. Instead of hunting enemies, he would be healing their victims. Instead of using violence to solve problems, he would be using medicine to address their consequences. The night before his departure, Marcus received a message from Jake Sullivan. It was brief, but carried the weight of their shared history. "Stay safe, document. We're proud of what you're doing." Marcus stared at the message for a long time, feeling the complex emotions it evoked. He was leaving behind brothers who had trusted him with their lives, but he was also honoring the values they had taught him about service and sacrifice. As his plane lifted off from Geneva, carrying him towards Syria and his new life as a humanitarian aid worker, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. The little girl in the Afghan compound who had asked why they hurt her had started a process of transformation that was only now reaching its conclusion. Marcus understood that he would carry the silence that had descended upon him for the rest of his life. But he also understood that this silence wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, full of the space needed for healing and growth and change. The warrior he had been was gone, but the healer he was becoming was just getting started. The makeshift hospital in northern Syria was nothing like the sterile medical facilities Marcus had trained in during his time with Medical Relief International. Located in a converted school building on the outskirts of a town that had been contested territory for 3 years, it consisted of 6 rooms with concrete floors, cracked walls, and windows covered with plastic sheeting to keep out dust and debris. When Marcus arrived at his new assignment, he was greeted by Dr. Sarah Okafor, a Nigerian physician who served as the team leader. Dr. Okafor was a woman in her late 30s who had been working in conflict zones for over a decade, and her calm efficiency in the face of chaos reminded Marcus of the best military officers he had served under. "Welcome to our little corner of hell," Dr. Okafor said with dark humor as she showed Marcus around the facility. "We treat an average of 40 patients a day, ranging from routine medical issues to severe trauma. The security situation changes constantly, so we have to be ready to evacuate on short notice." As Dr. Okafor explained the hospital's operations, Marcus found himself automatically assessing the facility from a tactical perspective. The building had multiple exit routes, good sight lines to potential approach routes, and defensive positions that could be held if necessary. It was a mindset he couldn't shake, even though his role here was fundamentally different from anything he had done as a SEAL. The medical team consisted of 8 people from 6 different countries. In addition to Dr. Okafor and Marcus, there was Dr. Jean-Paul Dubois, a French surgeon who specialized in trauma cases, Maria Santos, a Spanish nurse with experience in emergency medicine, Ahmed Hassan, a Syrian pharmacist who served as both translator and cultural liaison, Dr. Lisa Chun, an American pediatrician, Fatima Al-Rashid, a Jordanian nurse, and David Mitchell, a British paramedic who managed the hospital's logistics. What struck Marcus immediately about his new teammates was their ability to work together despite their diverse backgrounds. Unlike his SEAL team, which had been forged through years of shared training and common culture, this group had come together from completely different worlds but had somehow created an effective working unit. His first patient was a 7-year-old boy named Omar who had been injured when his family's apartment building was hit by artillery fire. Omar had suffered severe lacerations to his legs and was going into shock when he was brought to the hospital by his older sister, a girl who couldn't have been more than 12 herself. As Marcus worked to stabilize Omar's condition, he was struck by the similarities between this child and the little girl he had encountered in the Afghan compound months earlier. Both were victims of conflicts they had no part in creating. Both had been traumatized by events beyond their control. But there was a crucial difference. This time, Marcus was there to help heal rather than cause harm. The medical procedures required to save Omar's life were complex and required the entire team to work together. Dr. Dubois performed surgery to repair damaged blood vessels while Marcus managed the boy's shock and blood loss. Maria Santos assisted with the surgery, while Dr. Okafor coordinated with Ahmed Hassan to communicate with Omar's sister and other family members who had gathered outside the hospital. For 6 hours, the team fought to save Omar's life. There were moments when it seemed they might lose him, when his vital signs crashed, and Marcus had to use every skill he had learned during his years as a combat medic to pull the boy back from the edge of death. When Omar finally stabilized and was sleeping peacefully in the hospital's small recovery room, Marcus felt a sense of satisfaction unlike anything he had experienced during his military career. He had used his training and experience not to take a life, but to preserve one. The skills that had been developed for warfare had found new purpose in healing. "Good work," Dr. Okafor told him as they cleaned up after the surgery. "Omar wouldn't have made it without your expertise in trauma medicine." But Marcus knew that Omar's survival was due to the efforts of the entire team. His military training had given him valuable skills in working under pressure and managing critical situations, but those skills were only effective when combined with the medical expertise and cultural understanding of his teammates. Over the following weeks, Marcus settled into the rhythm of life at the field hospital. Each day brought new challenges and new patients, from routine medical problems to complex trauma cases. He treated children injured by unexploded ordnance, adults suffering from malnutrition and disease, and elderly people whose chronic conditions have been exacerbated by the stress and privation of living in a war zone. One of the most difficult aspects of the work was learning to maintain emotional boundaries while still providing compassionate care. During his time as a SEAL, Marcus had been trained to compartmentalize his emotions, to focus on the mission regardless of personal feelings. But humanitarian work required a different kind of emotional management. He needed to care deeply about his patients while also protecting himself from being overwhelmed by their suffering. Dr. Okafor helped him understand this balance during a conversation they had after a particularly difficult day when they had lost 2 patients despite their best efforts. "The trick," she told him, "is to remember that you can't save everyone, but you can save someone. Every life we preserve is a victory, even when we also experience defeats." Marcus thought about this philosophy as he continued his work. It was similar to what Dr. Morrison had told him during his training, but hearing it in the context of actual loss made it feel more real and more important. The security situation around the hospital was constantly changing, and Marcus found his military background invaluable in helping the team prepare for potential threats. He worked with David Mitchell to develop evacuation procedures and helped train the medical staff in basic security protocols. But unlike his military experience, where the goal was to eliminate threats through superior firepower, here the goal was to avoid confrontation entirely. When fighting broke out in the area, the medical team's response was to make themselves as small and non-threatening as possible, to clearly identify themselves as humanitarian workers, and to rely on the protection provided by international humanitarian law. This approach felt alien to Marcus at first. His instinct when faced with a threat was to respond with overwhelming force, to take control of the situation through superior tactics and firepower. Learning to rely on neutrality and legal protection instead of weapons and training required a fundamental shift in mindset. The shift was tested when fighting broke out just 2 blocks from the hospital during Marcus's 3rd week in Syria. He could hear small arms fire and explosions getting closer, and his military training told him to establish a defensive perimeter and prepare for combat. Instead, Following the protocols he had learned during his humanitarian training, Marcus helped the team raise large banners identifying the building as a medical facility, ensured that all weapons were secured and out of sight, and worked with Ahmed Hassan to contact both sides in the conflict to inform them of the hospital's location and neutral status. For 12 tense hours, Marcus and his teammates continued treating patients while the battle raged around them. Several times, stray bullets struck the building, and once a mortar round landed in the courtyard, shattering windows and sending everyone diving for cover. But throughout the crisis, the team maintained their commitment to neutrality. When fighters from both sides brought wounded comrades to the hospital, Marcus and his colleagues treated them all according to medical need rather than political affiliation. It was surreal to see men who had been trying to kill each other lying side by side in the recovery room, their shared humanity revealed by their wounds. During this crisis, Marcus experienced a profound moment of clarity about his transformation. As he worked to save the life of a young fighter who couldn't have been more than 18, Marcus realized that he felt no curiosity about which side the boy fought for or what ideology he supported. The only thing that mattered was the medical care needed to preserve his life. The silence that had descended upon Marcus after the compound raid in Afghanistan had evolved into something different during his months of humanitarian work. It was no longer the absence of certainty, but rather the presence of a deeper understanding about the nature of service and sacrifice. This understanding was tested in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated when a delegation from the U.S. military arrived at the hospital 6 months into his deployment. The delegation included a colonel from the Army Medical Corps who was studying how military medical personnel could work more effectively with humanitarian organizations. Among the delegation members was Jake Sullivan, who had requested permission to visit Marcus during his own deployment to a nearby base. Seeing his former team leader brought back a flood of memories and emotions that Marcus had thought he had processed and moved beyond. "How are you doing, Doc?" Jake asked when they had a chance to speak privately. "You look different." Marcus thought about the question. He was different in ways that were both subtle and profound. The constant hypervigilance that had characterized his military service had been replaced by a different kind of awareness, one focused on healing rather than threat assessment. "I'm good," Marcus said, and realized that it was true. "This work is challenging in different ways, but it feels right." Jake nodded, studying Marcus's face. "I can see it. You got a piece about you that wasn't there before." They talked for hours about Marcus's experiences in Syria, his work with the medical team, and the challenges of maintaining neutrality in conflict zones. Jake was genuinely interested in understanding how humanitarian work differed from military operations, and his questions helped Marcus articulate things about his transformation that he hadn't fully understood himself. "Do you ever miss it?" Jake asked. "The brotherhood, the clear mission, the sense of purpose we had?" Marcus thought about the question seriously. He did miss certain aspects of his military service: the camaraderie, the clearly defined objectives, the feeling of being part of something larger than himself. But he had found similar elements in his humanitarian work, expressed through different channels. "I miss you guys," Marcus said honestly. "But I don't miss the moral ambiguity, the situations where helping some people meant hurting others. Here, my purpose is clear: save lives, reduce suffering, maintain hope." Jake was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "You know, I think you found your calling." Not everyone gets that clarity about what they're supposed to be doing. When the military delegation left, Marcus felt a sense of completion about his transition. Seeing Jake again had confirmed that he had made the right choice. Not because military service was wrong, but because it wasn't right for him anymore. As his first year in Syria drew to a close, Marcus was offered the opportunity to extend his assignment or move to a different conflict zone. He chose to stay, feeling that he was finally hitting his stride as a humanitarian aid worker and that the team had become like a family to him. One evening, as he sat in a hospital's small break room writing a letter to his parents back in Texas, Omar appeared in the doorway. The 7-year-old boy whose life Marcus had helped save during his first week in Syria had become a regular visitor to the hospital, often bringing small gifts from his family and helping Ahmed Hassan with translation. Omar's English had improved dramatically over the months, and he had become something of a mascot for the medical team. His presence served as a daily reminder of why their work mattered, of the lives they were able to save, and the hope they were able to preserve. "Mr. Marcus," Omar said shyly, holding out a drawing he had made. "My sister helped me make this for you." The drawing showed the hospital with stick figures representing the medical team, surrounded by hearts and flowers. At the bottom, in carefully practiced English letters, Omar had written, "Thank you for helping us." As Marcus looked at the drawing, he thought about the question that had haunted him for so long. The question posed by a little girl in an Afghan compound who had asked why they hurt her. Omar's drawing didn't provide an answer to that question, but it offered something better, proof that healing was possible, that hope could be restored, that the silence within him had been transformed into something meaningful. Marcus understood now that his journey from warrior to healer wasn't complete, would never be complete. It was an ongoing process of growth and transformation, of finding new ways to serve and new purposes to pursue. The skills he had learned as a SEAL would always be part of him, but they had found new expression in his work as a humanitarian aid worker. The silence that had descended upon him during that firefight in Afghanistan had become a space for compassion, understanding, and hope. It was no longer empty, but full of the voices of the people he had helped, the lives he had saved, and the small victories he had achieved against the forces of suffering and despair. As he hung Omar's drawing on the wall of his small quarters, Marcus realized that he had finally found the answer to the question that had started his transformation. They didn't have to hurt. There were other ways to serve, other ways to make a difference, other ways to honor the bonds of brotherhood and the call of duty. The wounded had become the healer, the warrior had become the peacekeeper, and the silence had become a song of hope that would continue for as long as there were people who needed healing and someone willing to provide it. Marcus Rodriguez had found his true calling, and in doing so, he had discovered that being unshaken didn't mean being unchanging. It meant having the strength to transform while holding on to what mattered most.